The plan was bold, daring, and almost unbelievable. In just 10 days, the Allies hoped to end the war by Christmas, cutting deep into Nazi territory, capturing key bridges, and opening a road straight to Germany's heart. But what began as a dream of victory ended in chaos, destruction, and one of the costliest failures of the Second World War. This is the story of Operation Market Garden, the plan that failed. Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most ambitious and controversial military operations in modern history, a plan that mixed brilliance with overconfidence, courage with tragedy, and ultimately showed how even the best-laid strategies can crumble under the weight of reality. It's September 1944. The Allies have stormed through France after the success of D-Day. Paris is liberated, German forces are retreating in disarray, and morale among Allied troops is sky high. To many commanders, the war seems nearly over. But there's a problem: the supply lines are stretched thin. Fuel and ammunition are running dangerously low, and the Germans, though battered, are far from broken. In this fragile moment, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposes a daring plan, one that he believes will break the stalemate and end the war by Christmas. Montgomery's vision is simple in words, but monumental in execution. It's called Operation Market Garden, a two-part assault combining airborne and ground forces. The market part involves thousands of paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines to seize key bridges in the Netherlands. The garden part is the ground offense. If a single armored thrust up a narrow highway to link up with the airborne troops and push into the industrial Ruhr, Germany's heartland. On paper, it looks brilliant. If successful, the Allies would bypass the heavily fortified Siegfried Line, cross the Rhine River, and punch straight into Germany. But the operation's success depends on perfect timing, flawless coordination, and a long stretch of luck. Inside the Allied planning rooms, the mood is electric. Maps of the Netherlands are spread across tables, red and blue arrows tracing the routes of attack. British, American, and Polish commanders argue over landing zones and timetables. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, hesitates. He prefers a broad, front approach, advancing steadily across Western Europe rather than one narrow push. But Montgomery is persuasive and confident. He promises a quick victory. After weeks of debate, Eisenhower agrees. Operation Market Garden gets the green light. The plan is bold. 3 airborne divisions will drop into Holland along a 60-mile corridor. The American 101st Airborne will capture bridges near Eindhoven. The 82nd Airborne will take the crossings over the Maas and Wal rivers around Nijmegen. Farther north, the British 1st Airborne Division, along with the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, will drop near Arnhem to seize the crucial bridge over the Lower Rhine, the final link in the chain. Once the paratroopers secure their objectives, the British XXX Corps, a powerful armored column under Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, will race north along a single highway known later as Hell's Highway to relieve them. The interior side of the plan, the strategy, logistics, and timing, is extraordinarily complex. Every minute matters. The airborne troops will have to hold their positions for at least 2 days before the tanks reach them. But communication between air and ground units is risky. Weather conditions are unpredictable, and the Dutch terrain, flat fields, canals, and dikes, offers little room for maneuver. Despite these concerns, optimism prevails. The Allies believe the Germans are in full retreat and incapable of mounting a serious defense. Yet outside the war rooms, the reality on the ground tells a different story. In the Dutch countryside, German forces are regrouping. 2 SS Panzer Division's elite armored units are refitting near Arnhem, a detail the Allies underestimate. Dutch resistance fighters, risking their lives, report this information to British intelligence, but their warnings are dismissed. The operation, already scheduled, moves ahead. On the morning of September 17, 1944, the skies over southern Holland roar with the sound of engines. More than 2-0 aircraft fill the air, the largest airborne assault in history up to that point. American, British, and Polish paratroopers leap from their planes, descending through clouds into enemy territory. Civilians on the ground cheer and wave flags, believing liberation has arrived. The landings are largely successful at first. The 101st Airborne quickly secures several bridges near Eindhoven, though one key bridge at Sun is destroyed by German engineers before it can be captured. The 82nd Airborne faces stiff resistance near Nijmegen, but manages to take the Grosbeek Heights, a vital defensive position. Further north, the British 1st Airborne Division drops near Arnhem, but things begin to go wrong almost immediately. Due to miscalculations and limited transport aircraft, the British are forced to land miles away from their main objective, the Arnhem Bridge. Radio equipment fails to work properly, cutting off communication between units. Meanwhile, German forces near, by including tanks from the SS Panzer divisions, begin to mobilize faster than expected. The British paratroopers, lightly armed and isolated, advance toward Arnhem through narrow streets and scattered villages, facing increasing resistance at every turn. Inside Arnhem, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and his men manage to reach the northern end of the bridge and set up defensive positions. They hold it heroically against waves of German counterattacks, but they are heavily outnumbered and cut off from reinforcements. The rest of the division, trapped in the suburbs and woods west of the city, struggles to break through. Meanwhile, the ground offense, if the garden part, faces its own challenges. The tanks of XXX Corps encounter unexpected resistance, destroyed bridges, and constant ambushes along the narrow road. Traffic jams, mines, and artillery fire slow their progress to a crawl. The narrowness of the highway means the armored column can only move in single file, making it easy for the Germans to block or delay them. Every hour counts, and every delay costs lives. As night falls, the airborne troops dig in, hoping the tanks will arrive soon. But as messages fail to get through and the sound of engines never comes, a grim realization sets in they might be on their own for far longer than planned. The interior of the plan coordination, timing, communication begins to crumble under pressure. The exterior, the battlefield reality, grows harsher by the minute. What was supposed to be a lightning strike is turning into a desperate struggle for survival. And at the northern tip of the operation, in Arnhem, a small band of British soldiers now find themselves trapped against overwhelming odds, holding onto a single bridge, the bridge that was supposed to open the road to victory. The second day of Operation Market Garden dawned under gray Dutch skies. The optimism that filled the air just 24 hours earlier was fading fast. While the paratroopers held their fragile positions, the ground troops were fighting for every mile of the narrow road to Arnhem. The operation that was meant to unfold like clockwork was already starting to slip out of control. At the southern end of the corridor, the 101st Airborne was locked in heavy combat around Sun and Veghel. They had secured most of their objectives, but the destroyed bridge at Sun was a critical setback. Engineers worked through the night to construct a makeshift Bailey bridge so that XXX Corps could continue their advance. Each delay meant that the men trapped farther north had to hold out longer against the tightening German defenses. Every hour lost on the road was an hour the Germans used to regroup. Further up the line, the 82nd Airborne faced its own nightmare. The Germans were quick to counterattack around Nijmegen and the Maas River crossings. Major General James Gavin, commander of the 82nd, realized that without capturing the large bridge over the Wall River, the entire operation would choke. But the bridge was heavily defended, and the paratroopers lacked armor and artillery support. Gavin's men dug in around the town, preparing for one of the most daring assaults of the war. Meanwhile, inside Arnhem, the situation was dire. Colonel John Frost and roughly 700 of his men still held the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge. Surrounded by German tanks and infantry, cut off from supplies, they fought from shattered buildings and basements, turning every house into a fortress. The British radio operators could barely transmit messages through static and interference. They could hear distant artillery from the south, but no sign of the friendly tanks that were supposed to relieve them. Ammunition was running low, food was nearly gone, yet morale somehow remained unbroken. Outside the city, the rest of the 1st Airborne Division under Major General Roy Urquhart was struggling to regroup. German forces had already blocked the main routes to Arnhem, forcing the paratroopers into scattered pockets of resistance. Urquhart himself became separated from his headquarters for almost 2 days, hiding in attics and farmhouses while trying to rejoin his command. By the time he did, the division was fractured and exhausted. The German response had been far stronger than anyone in the Allied High Command had anticipated. Back at Montgomery's headquarters, reports from the field painted a picture of confusion. Communication failures, missing intelligence, and unrealistic timetables were combining into a slow-motion disaster. Yet Montgomery remained confident, insisting that progress was being made and that Arnhem would soon be reached. To the planners, it was still possible to save the operation if the tanks could just keep moving. But the exterior reality along the road told another story. The British XXX Corps was facing fierce resistance from German units determined to cut the Allied corridor in half. The single highway elevated above flat farmland became a deadly bottleneck. Tanks could only move in one direction, and any destroyed vehicle blocked the entire route. German artillery from the flanking dikes rained fire on the column. Infantry units on bicycles, local civilians, and supply trucks crowded the road, creating chaos. Soldiers nicknamed it Hell's Highway for a reason. In the small Dutch villages, the war's brutality was everywhere. Civilians watched from their windows as their homes were shelled, burned, or occupied by troops. Some risked their lives to guide Allied soldiers through back routes or to hide the wounded. Others were caught in the crossfire, victims of a battle that turned their towns into ruins. Liberation for many was coming at a terrible cost. By September 19th, the cracks in Market Garden were impossible to ignore. Frost's men at the Arnhem Bridge were now completely surrounded. German tanks from the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions hammered their positions with relentless fire. Buildings collapsed, flames filled the air, and the bridge itself shook with explosions. The defenders used every bullet, grenade, and piece of rubble they could find. When they ran out of ammunition, they fought hand to hand. For 4 days, they held on longer than anyone could have expected, but without relief, their stand could not last. The 82nd Airborne, recognizing the urgency, prepared for an extraordinary maneuver to capture the Nijmegen Bridge. On September 20th, under heavy enemy fire, American paratroopers of the 504th Regiment launched an amphibious assault across the Wall River in small wooden boats. Many were hit before reaching the far bank, but the survivors stormed the German defenses, capturing the bridge in one of the most heroic actions of the operation. As night fell, British tanks finally rumbled across, continuing north toward Arnhem, but it was already too late. Inside Arnhem, Frost's last radio message crackled out. Out of ammo, God save the king. His men had fought to the end. The survivors were captured or killed. Only a handful managed to escape through the ruins. The bridge, their prize, remained in German hands. Arnhem, the final and most important objective, was lost. Still, Montgomery and his staff refused to declare the operation a failure. They ordered the remaining airborne troops to form a defensive perimeter at Oosterbeek, west of Arnhem, and hold out until reinforcements could arrive. For the exhausted paratroopers, this meant another desperate fight against overwhelming odds. The landscape turned into a nightmare of smoke, rain, and blood. Wounded men filled every cellar. Medical supplies were gone, food was scarce, and the constant shelling never stopped. At the same time, the Germans launched coordinated counterattacks all along the corridor. The narrow Allied supply line was cut in multiple places, forcing XXX Corps to divert resources just to keep it open. Tanks that were meant to charge ahead to Arnhem were instead used to defend the road behind them. The dream of a rapid advance to the Rhine was slipping away hour by hour. Inside the Allied headquarters, tension grew. Eisenhower received conflicting reports. American commanders like Patton, operating farther south, were frustrated that critical resources had been diverted to Montgomery's plan. Bradley's staff questioned whether the entire operation had been based on wishful thinking rather than solid intelligence. Yet in the field, ordinary soldiers continued to fight with extraordinary courage, trying to make the impossible possible. By the fourth day, the paratroopers at Oosterbeek were surrounded on three sides. German tanks prowled the outskirts, their engines echoing through the rain-soaked woods. Still, the British dug in, refusing to surrender. Polish paratroopers under General Stanislaw Sosabowski were dropped south of the Rhine to reinforce them, but strong winds scattered their landing, and many were killed or captured before they could reach the main force. It was heroism met with futility gallantry against an unrelenting tide. The people of Arnhem and the nearby villages suffered alongside the soldiers. Thousands were trapped in their homes without water or power, forced to live in cellars while shells exploded above. Dutch civilians carried wounded soldiers to makeshift hospitals and shared their last bits of food. What had begun as a plan for liberation now brought only destruction to the towns it was meant to save. As the sun set on the fifth day of Operation Market Garden, the reality became undeniable. The ground offensive had stalled, the paratroopers were isolated, the Rhine, the final goal, remained uncrossed. The plan that was supposed to end the war quickly was turning into one of its greatest disappointments. But for the men still holding the line at Oosterbeek, surrender was not yet an option. They clung to the hope that reinforcements might break through, that somehow, against all odds, the promise of Market Garden could still be redeemed. The battle for survival was not over. It was only about to reach its darkest chapter. The final days of Operation Market Garden were a desperate struggle for survival. Rain poured endlessly over the Dutch countryside, turning the fields into mud and the air into mist. The paratroopers at Oosterbeek, surrounded and exhausted, clung to their shrinking perimeter with sheer determination. The thunder of artillery echoed day and night, shaking the earth and blotting out all sense of time. The plan that had begun with confidence and precision now dissolved into chaos and heartbreak. Inside the perimeter, the situation was catastrophic. The British 1st Airborne Division, once 10,000 strong, was reduced to scattered pockets of resistance. They occupied trenches, basements, and gardens, using fallen trees and debris as makeshift barricades. Food was gone, ammunition almost spent, and medical supplies nearly exhausted. Field medics worked tirelessly under fire, turning churches and homes into emergency hospitals. The wounded lay shoulder to shoulder, whispering prayers as shells burst outside. For many, the only comfort came from the Dutch civilians who refused to abandon the men, women, and children who brought water, tore their own sheets for bandages, and risked execution to help the wounded. The German forces, meanwhile, tightened their grip. reinforcements poured into the area, including tanks, artillery, and seasoned infantry. SS Commander Wilhelm Bittrich, recognizing the Allies' isolation, methodically encircled the British positions, cutting off all routes of escape. German propaganda broadcasts taunted the defenders, urging them to surrender, but the paratroopers refused. They had come to hold the Rhine bridgehead, and they would hold it to the last man if they had to. On the southern bank of the Rhine, the Polish brigade fought valiantly to reach their trapped comrades. General Sosabowski's men landed under terrible conditions, scattered by wind and rain, many drowning in flooded fields before even firing a shot. Those who survived faced machine, gunfire from the dikes, and were unable to link up with the British across the river. Despite their bravery, they could do little more than provide covering fire from afar. The river that was supposed to be crossed triumphantly now stood as an impassable barrier, mocking the ambitions of Market Garden. For the soldiers of XXX Corps, the frustration was unbearable. They could hear the distant sounds of battle across the Rhine, but were powerless to reach the airborne troops. Every attempt to advance met with fierce resistance. Bridges were blown, roads were blocked, and the German counterattacks came relentlessly. What was meant to be a single swift thrust northward had become a slow, grinding fight for every yard. Supplies were dwindling, vehicles were bogged down in mud, and exhaustion set in. The dream of breaking through to Arnhem was slipping away for good. By September 24th, a full week into the operation, Montgomery's staff finally accepted the inevitable. The airborne troops north of the Rhine could not be saved. The focus shifted from victory to survival, from taking ground to saving lives. Plans were drawn up for an evacuation code, named Operation Berlin, a name grimly fitting for the disaster it described. That night, under the cover of darkness and rain, the remnants of the 1st Airborne began their retreat. Small groups moved silently through the woods toward the riverbanks, guided by local Dutch resistance fighters who knew the terrain better than anyone. Engineers on the southern side prepared boats to ferry them across. It was a desperate gamble. The Germans, suspicious of any movement, fired flares into the sky and swept the fields with machine gun fire. Many soldiers were hit as they tried to cross. Some drowned in the current, weighed down by their gear. Others reached the opposite shore only to collapse from exhaustion. Yet, against all odds, more than 2,000 men made it out alive that night. At dawn, the silence over Oosterbeek was broken only by the wind and the cries of the wounded left behind. Nearly 1,500 men were dead, over 6,000 captured, and the once proud British 1st Airborne Division was effectively destroyed. The survivors who reached the Allied lines were greeted not with cheers of triumph, but with grim nods of respect. They had fought with unmatched courage, but courage alone had not been enough to overcome the impossible. When Montgomery received word of the outcome, his response was cautious and political. He called Operation Market Garden 90% successful, arguing that it had established a bridgehead across the Rhine even if Arnhem had not been captured. But among the soldiers who had fought there, and among the Dutch who had suffered under the fighting, the truth was clear: it had been a failure. The Rhine had not been crossed, the war had not ended by Christmas, and the cost had been devastating. For the people of the Netherlands, the aftermath was even more tragic. The northern provinces remained under German occupation for months. In retaliation for the Dutch resistance's support of the Allies, the Germans imposed brutal punishments and cut off food supplies. That winter, known as the Hunger Winter, would claim the lives of more than 20,000 civilians. The liberation they had glimpsed with the falling parachutes had turned into a long, bitter ordeal. In the Allied ranks, questions arose. Why had intelligence warnings been ignored? Why were the paratroopers dropped so far from their objectives? Why was the plan so dependent on a single road, vulnerable to every possible disruption? Historians would later describe Market Garden as a masterpiece of ambition undone by faulty assumptions, a plan that aimed for too much, too fast, based on the belief that the enemy was weaker than he really was. The interior analysis of the operation revealed layer after layer of overconfidence. Commanders underestimated the strength of the German forces near Arnhem, overestimated the speed of the ground advance, and relied on weather conditions that were never guaranteed. Communications between air and ground units broke down repeatedly. Coordination between American, British, and Polish forces suffered from confusion and differing priorities. In short, the operation demanded perfection, and war, as it always does, delivered chaos instead. Yet for all its failure, Market Garden remains one of the most extraordinary displays of bravery in modern warfare. The men who fought at Arnhem, Nijmegen, and Eindhoven were not defeated by cowardice or lack of will. They were defeated by circumstance, by miscalculation, and by the sheer unpredictability of war. Their stand at Arnhem became legendary, the bridge too far, that symbolized both the limits of human planning and the boundless courage of those who execute it. In the years that followed, the memory of Market Garden endured. The Dutch people never forgot the sacrifices made on their soil. Every year, veterans returned to Arnhem to lay wreaths on the bridge, now renamed John Frost Bridge in honor of the man who led the defense. Children of the Netherlands placed flowers on the graves of British and Polish soldiers, a quiet gesture of gratitude that continues to this day. From a broader perspective, Market Garden changed the course of the war in subtle ways. Though it failed to achieve its immediate goal, it forced the Allies to rethink their strategy. Instead of a rapid strike into Germany, they returned to the slower, grinding advance across the Western Front. It delayed the liberation of the Netherlands and extended the war in Europe by several months, ensuring that the final victory in May 1945 would come only after immense further suffering. But perhaps the greatest lesson of Market Garden lies not in its failure, but in its humanity. It showed the thin line between triumph and disaster, between brilliance and hubris. It revealed how even the most meticulous plans can unravel in the face of uncertainty, and it proved that courage, true courage, is not found in victory, but in perseverance against impossible odds. As the final shots faded and the rain stopped falling over Arnhem, the surviving paratroopers looked back across the Rhine, knowing they had done everything humanly possible. They had not taken the bridge. They had not ended the war, but they had written a story of endurance that would outlast the war itself. And so, Operation Market Garden stands as both a warning and a tribute, a reminder of the limits of strategy and the limitless depth of human bravery. The plan had failed, but the men who fought it did not. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most fascinating and tragic operations, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, stay curious and keep history alive.